We are not John McWhorter. I am Gretchen McCulloch.
We're also not Ben Zimmer. I'm Lane Green.
And we are your emergency co-MCs for the 5-Minute Linguist. And also, we are your judges. And also, I have a file of bad linguistics puns in case the technology goes wrong. So I hope I will not have to be your pun master, but if the occasion necessitates, this might happen. We are very pleased to welcome the finalists for the 5-Minute Linguist competition who have all written excellent abstracts to get here so far. Give them a round of applause in advance. And we also want to note that you collectively, except maybe for our contestants, are also judges. So you will get to judge the participants at the end. You might want to take some notes. We don't want to get too recency effecty. Let's do some proper experimental design. You will get to vote. The details for voting will be displayed to you on this screen when I'm not in charge of that part. We'd also like to put a plug out for the 5-Minute Linguist contest in general. We received some great abstracts this year. We'd like to encourage people to continue submitting those, and especially to note that if you're going to check that I'd like to be part of this 5-Minute Linguist box, we really want to encourage you to showcase your explaining things to the public skills in that short abstract as well, because that's one of the things we're really evaluating you on. So we'd love to see people exercising those skills at the abstract level in order for us to get even more participants, well, not more participants, but like getting more people engaged as this continues to grow and become a thing year after year.
I want to say a brief word. I'm Lane Green from The Economist magazine, so I want to say that in some way, you are my sources for the things I write and the things I like to learn from, and I'm in awe of being a judge of those of you who do this great work that I draw so much from. But in a way, you need me, because you need to reach the people I can reach with my writing in journalism, and you need people like me who don't know nearly as much about your subject as you do. So this is really a great showcase for your ability to think like the people that don't have your PhD, don't have your knowledge. Steve Pinker likes to talk about the curse of knowledge, the fact that you can't put yourself in the mind of someone who doesn't know what you know. Well, that is what you were going to be doing today. That is your task, to think like someone who doesn't have your background and the depth of knowledge. You have to do what we call at The Economist, simplify and exaggerate. I know that doesn't come easily to academics. You have error bars, you think in terms of clouds of probability, but you have to overcome that a little bit. You have to overcome your own fear of this notion, and you have to make it clear in 5 minutes. You can't even clear your throat in 5 minutes in most academic works, but you've got only about that much time to reach most of the general public. So we look forward to seeing how you will do that for us today.
And if you want more thoughts about communicating linguistics to the general public, I'm going to put in a brief plug for my own panel tomorrow morning, which is on linguistics in the public ear, podcasts and radio linguistics, which is happening at 9 a.m. in a room that is on the schedule and not in my brain right now. A couple brief notes about the structure of this event. So we're going to have each of the participants coming up and giving a talk, except for Zachary Jagger, I knew I was going to say that wrong, who's going to be giving his by video because of weather. And he's going first. And then between each talk, as the tech gets reset up, Lane and I will be giving brief positive comments. Neither of us are Simon Cowell. This is not a public shaming event. But we do want to say, a couple nice things about each talk as it goes along. On with the show. Okay, so this is going to be Zachary up on your screen for you.
How do you say this place name? Does the second vowel you say sound more like the vowel in the word lot or the word trap? Well, it looks like this might be a political accent. Researchers looked at how American politicians pronounce this place name. Conservatives were more likely to use the trap vowel,
Iraq,
while liberals were more likely to use the lot vowel,
Iraq.
a pronunciation closer to how this word sounds in Arabic. But I suspected that speakers who aren't politicians might also pattern the same way, especially seeing how political identity has become a stronger part of Americans' identities in general lately. So, round one. I went around asking random people to do a geography quiz. I'd hand them a list of place names and ask them to say them in the order of how hot they think they get during the summer. I didn't care at all whether they were correct, I just cared about how they pronounced them. Then I asked for further info about them, like their political identity. Sure enough, the same pattern held. Liberals were more likely to say Iraq. Conservatives were more likely to say Iraq. But I wanted to know how much was this really about politics, or if it's a result of other social factors that pattern with politics. So what are these other possible influences? One might be attitude. From linguistic research, we know that different people or different social groups might speak the same language, but their speech might still differ in subtle ways, like their pronunciation. We also find that the more positive attitude you hold toward a certain person or social group, the more the way they speak might have an influence on the way you speak, where your speech might come to resemble theirs more and more. So, if you have a more positive attitude toward people from a certain place, you might be more likely to pronounce the name of that place like they do in their language. And it looks like relevant attitudes do pattern with US politics. Liberals are more likely to hold more positive attitudes towards Arabs and Arab Americans than those held by conservatives, which could explain why liberals are more likely to say
Iraq.
But something I didn't tell you about the geography quiz from before was that the same pattern held for other place names of less political charge. Liberals were more likely, in general, to pronounce place names in ways more similar to how people from those places pronounce them, like Iraq, Chile, or Quebec, versus Iraq, Chile, or Quebec. So this might not be about attitudes toward a particular group, place, or language. This led me to think that the broader factor of globalism might be causing this, which also appears to pattern with US politics, especially in recent politics, where liberals tend to hold a more globalist ideology, while conservatives tend to hold a more nationalist ideology. For example, say foreign people from different cultures enter the US. Someone with a more nationalist ideology might more strongly expect them to adjust to a way of life that fits in more and feels less foreign. And this same pattern might hold for foreign words entering the language. Say one language is in strong contact with speakers of another language. It might be inclined to borrow a word from that language, but some might have a stronger feeling that at least the pronunciation of that word should be adjusted to a pronunciation that fits in more and feels less foreign. So, to recap, we have this political pattern in the pronunciation of foreign words between pronunciations that more or less closely resemble how they're pronounced in their original languages, like Iraq, Iraq. But this could be a result of other social factors that also pattern with politics in parallel directions. Which leads us to round 2. I had people read a random list of words out loud that included place names with variable pronunciations, like Iraq, Iraq, or Iran, Iran. Then I had them do a survey, getting responses like strongly agree, somewhat disagree, with different statements getting at factors like their political identity, my political views are usually conservative, their attitudes regarding the Middle East, there are aspects of Middle Eastern culture that make me uncomfortable, or their alignment with a globalist or a nationalist kind of persona. I consider myself sensitive to other cultures. Then I looked at how strongly these social factors patterned with whether people used the A pronunciation, Iraq or Iran, versus the A pronunciation, Iraq or Iran. So we might imagine that the more positive attitude someone has regarding the Middle East, the more likely they are to use the A pronunciations, and vice versa. And sure enough, that seems to be the case. People with more positive attitudes regarding the Middle East were more likely to use the pronunciations more similar to how people from those places pronounce them. But actually, how global they identified was a much stronger predictor, with people identifying as more global more likely to use the A pronunciations, while political identity itself was actually the weakest predictor. So it looks like, while this pronunciation difference patterns with political identity, it may not be a purely political accent in and of itself. Instead, it seems like this political speech pattern falls out from and reflects the attitudes and ideologies that pattern with US politics.
Do you have slides? Okay. Oh yeah, so we're going to offer comments while you get your slides set up.
So what do you think, Gretchen?
I like that. It was good. I liked.
Well, one of the things I might have liked to seen is a look at the Iraq and Iraq pronunciation, Iran and we looked at the second vowel there and not the first, but a nice ingenious study that gave us a very clear result, and I like the surprise that it wasn't so much political ideology left-right as it was globalism versus nationalism. So you can imagine the sort of famous Reagan Democrats who might be union members and might be traditional Democratic voters, but who don't think about the rest of the world that much. They might be Iran and Iraq people, and that was a nice surprise.
Yeah, I think that was interesting. I liked the use of visuals in terms of like displaying the information one bit at a time. So when he had the graphs up, there was these, there were the graphs appeared piecemeal, which I thought was very effective to focus us on the information as it happened. I think Georgia's ready. So this is Georgia Zell.
Hi. Is this working? Maybe I don't want to stand in front of you. All languages are complex systems. This makes learning another language really challenging. When we listen to speech in a foreign language, it's pretty straightforward to group distinct speech sounds into syllables. So listen to this speech stream that many of you might not be familiar with.
مرحبا كيف حالك؟
But chopping up the speech signal, grouping together those syllables into larger units into words is not as straightforward. So this is sort of a fundamental question. How do we discover those words, those words in fluent speech in a foreign language? We want to look at whether learners use acoustic cues that are present in the speech signal to group together syllables into words. So we want to look at articulation in particular. Even more particular, we want to look at an aspect of speech called co-articulation. So co-articulation means that when we produce sounds in a word, they overlap with each other. Take, for example, the word poppy. It contains two vowels, an ah vowel and an e vowel, which are really distinct sounds, both articulatorily and acoustically. But when we produce these sounds in a word, they become more like each other. So ah is kind of e-like because our mouth gets in position to produce the e. This goes both ways. E is also ah-like. So because co-articulation is a natural and ubiquitous property of speaking, we want to ask whether learners use co-articulation to identify which syllables cohere or group together when they're listening to non-native speech, to foreign speech. So we might predict that enhancing that co-articulation might help learners by providing some sort of glue, sticking together the syllables to identify words in fluent speech. There's another prediction, though. We might expect the opposite to be the case. So when we produce words in a hyper-enunciated way, we isolate the syllables because we're speaking very slowly. This is how, for example, we think how speaking to foreigners, tourists, for example, on our streets who don't speak our language, we think maybe that's the best way for them to understand us, right? We speak very telegraphically. So maybe that's the best way for people to learn words. So we want to test these two competing hypotheses. So what we did is we created speech streams that had either reduced or enhanced co-articulation. We made an artificial language. We don't want to use a language that anyone could know or could have heard, because then they'll know what to look for. So making up words like gapi and creating speech that either reduced the co-articulation, so exemplified that telegraphic way of speaking, which sounds something like this.
Gapi.
We also created a speech stream that enhanced the co-articulation, made those vowels even more like one another within the word, had more glue, and that sounded like this.
Gapi.
These are very subtle differences, but prior work has shown that listeners are sensitive to them. So we had listeners listen to these speech streams for a couple minutes, and then afterwards we wanted to test how well they learned those words. So we gave them a test. We gave them questions like, which of these was a word in the language you heard? Gapi, something they heard, or something they hadn't heard, like piga. So they had to choose which one. So since there were two options, if they just guessed, in other words, didn't learn, they would show chance accuracy, which would be 50%. So let's look at how the reduced co-articulation, the telegraphic speech learners did. they did perform above chance. They did show some learning. So they did learn the words. However, the enhanced co-articulation group, those who heard the speech with more glue, learned the words even better. So greater co-articulation, more of that speech glue, does give learners a boost in finding those words, grouping those syllables together in fluent speech. So we addressed our question. We found that subtle acoustic cues do help learners find words in the speech stream. And our next questions have to do with, what about babies? What about first language learners? Do they also use speech glue to find those words in the fluent speech stream? We're also using this research to address sort of fundamental questions in the evolution and emergence of sound patterns in languages all over the world. Thank you.
Yeah, Georgia. Thank you, Georgia. And we'll let Lauren Ackerman get set up as we give feedback on Georgia. So one of the things that I really liked about this talk is that it had a very clear motivation of the problem at the beginning of why is this something interesting and kind of what's going on here that makes us want to address this question at the end. And then it left us with the sense of, well, there's further research that we could keep going. So it had this very clear transition into and transition out of the topic. Lane?
One of the things I noticed is that co-articulation is not something that's in a lot of lay people's vocabulary. So we understood that at the beginning that vowels will be a little bit more like each other when they're in the same word. But we had this nice metaphor of speech glue, the idea that this brought these two vowels closer to each other. And that metaphor sticks, in the mind after you've heard it once. And I thought that was very helpful for the lay listener like me.
Great. I think we're set to get go for Lauren Ackerman.
Okay, co-reference dependency formation is modulated by experience with variation in human gender. That is a mouthful, so I'm going to break it down. Co-reference dependency formation just means how we interpret pronouns. Modulated by experience means based on our understanding, and variation in human gender is what it means to be he, she, or they. So when we encounter sentences like, on the red carpet, all of Taylor's fans were screaming to get attention, you missed a word. If that word that you missed was her, you could have been referring to, or the person could have been referring to Taylor Swift. If the word that you missed was his, the person could have been referring to Taylor Lautner. Or if the word that you missed was there, the person could be referring to the character Taylor Mason from the TV show Billions, played by non-binary actor Asia Kate Dillon. In any of these cases, what we're doing with the pronoun is picking out some sort of gender or range of genders that the person we're referring to could be. So, when I say gender, a lot of people will think there's two categories, but in actuality, it's a range of things. And most people fall into one end or the other, so we call it bimodal. There's these two big bumps on the end. And when we use standard pronouns like he and she, we label people on this scale as one or the other, more feminine or more masculine. And people in the middle typically get labeled one or the other depending on how they're perceived. But this helps us, too, in determining who we're talking about. So when we get to the co-reference dependency portion, the interpreting pronouns, we can talk about sentences like Chloe dressed herself, where herself can only refer to Chloe and not to anyone else in the world based on this sentence. We can also manipulate that, which is what I did in my first experiment. So Chloe dressed himself might sound a little weird to you. Either I've made a mistake in the words I've chosen, or I'm trying to communicate to you something about my attitude towards Chloe and something about Chloe's gender. We can also say sentences like Taylor dressed herself, himself, or themself. And these, because Taylor doesn't encode a particular gender in that name, it's not clear who we're referring to until we find out the gender from the pronoun. But going back to Chloe dressed himself, you might expect that people would hear this sentence and think, that's not a very good sentence if you're being asked whether or not you accept the sentence as natural in English. And in fact, people have quite a range of responses. So in this graph, younger people tend to rate sentences like Chloe dressed himself more highly than older people. So what could be going on is that younger people have less experience with humans in the world. And so every new human that they meet constitutes a larger proportion of their input. And so with non-binary genders and transgender individuals becoming more salient in the media and in daily life, this might be pushing the means of these two categories closer together and causing the boundary to blur or overlap. Now, back to transgender and non-binary individuals, if we're talking about Taylor and they are a non-binary person, we may refer to them with a pronoun like themself or themselves. But we can also refer to pronouns like someone with themself or themselves, like someone dressed themselves. And that's a very common use. Even if you don't know that you do it, you probably do. So I also looked at sentences like this. Now, the really cool part of this study is I checked to see whether the people who were rating these sentences had ever interacted with transgender and non-binary individuals. And a quarter of my participants did, so I took a look at how their scores correlated with how much experience they had or how frequently they interacted. And it turned out that in 3 of these 4 sentences, the more experience they had, the higher they rated the sentences, so the more acceptable they were. The only one that was rated low was the one that is probably the most common in everyday speech, someone dressed themselves. So that actually makes a lot of sense. And what we can take from this is that not only are these categories potentially blurring, at least for younger people, but that we might be getting a third category. Well, when I say we, I mean people who have a lot of experience with transgender or non-binary people might have enough input to develop a third category besides just he and she. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. So I like this study. It's very zeitgeisty. It's very of the now. It talks about something that a lot of people have on our minds. A lot of people have on their minds. Someone's got it on their mind right now, and I'm one of those people thinking a lot about these issues. I think this is something that's going to hit a lot of people in an emotional way as well as a scientific one.
I think at a very technical level, one of the things I liked about this presentation was that it returned to the same graphic and kept changing aspects of the information on that one graphic. And so saying, okay, here's the version of the graphic with binary gender, here's this version of the graphic with they in the middle. And so talking about how things change across the lifespan, I found that changing the same graphic was very effective in doing that. And now we'll turn it over to Michelle McSweeney.
Hi there. So the title of this talk is Can I Get a Comma? And by the end of this talk, I'll let you know if you can or not. But before that, let me tell you a little bit about my personal life. So I live in Brooklyn, New York. And every time I go over to my mother-in-law's house, I come away with this thick Brooklyn accent. You know, I go over for tea, we have coffee, I got to get the creamer and the sugar. It's great. And what's going on there is a process called linguistic convergence. And linguistic convergence is when we adopt the speech patterns of the people around us. And for the most part, we do this when we want people to like us. And it has some really important social consequences. Convergers are considered warmer, friendlier, more trustworthy than non-convergers. But just like all things, convergence can go a little bit too far and cross into mimicry. And we don't like mimickers. We don't trust them. And typically, when we've studied convergence, we've studied what people do to converge. And what's interesting is that we can't really study very well what people don't do. But in comes text messaging. So text messaging is unique because it's written down, right? So we can study both what people do and what they don't do. Makes it a whole lot easier. Couple that with computational tools, and it becomes much easier. And as you may or may not have noticed, text messaging is taking over the planet. Young adults today send upwards of 100 messages every single day. And it's not uncommon to send 500, 600, more than that. And it has some really important features. First off, it's decontextualized, so you don't have any physical or any oral cues to help you understand the social context of the message. It's all there in the writing. And this is really cool because it means that we can study things like social context of text messaging. So I was really curious what my students were texting about, so I got a corpus. It's about 40, you don't want to know. It's about 44,000 text messages sent and received by bilingual young adults in New York City. And the way I got it was they plugged their phones into my computer. I made a copy of their entire messaging history and gave them back their phone. Now, this is important because we have conversations that are still intact. So rather than seeing only what they're sending, I can also see what they're responding to. And this is a perfect environment to study convergence. So I identified 50 features that I was really interested in, features that are endemic to text messaging. So things like abbreviations like bro and grax for gracias, acronyms like WYA for where you at, emojis like see no evil monkey emoji and smiling face with hard eyes emoji, laughter particles like LMAO and haha, and punctuation like exclamation points and our beloved comma. And I traced the use of these features through the entire social network. But it's really hard to look at 100 people all at once, so let's look at 3. This is Jasmine, her boyfriend Michael, and her BFF Erica. Jasmine is a lover of the emoji. She sends face-throwing kiss emoji all of the time. And Michael is more than willing to oblige her and converge on her emojis. So she sends 3, face-throwing a kiss emoji. He sends 3. She sends 2. He sends 2. They converge on emojis. Kind of awesome. Erica is also, so she also texts with Erica. And Jasmine is also a huge fan of the exclamation point. She is a woman after my own heart. Almost every message she sends has an exclamation point in it. And in her 600 messages with Erica, Erica never sends a single exclamation point back. And it's not the case that Erica's not a converger. That WYA that you see, she got that from Jasmine. So what's going on here? Well, we have 2 categories of features. We have features that are involved in convergence, emojis, acronyms, abbreviations, and features that are not, punctuation and laughter particles. This means that if you are an LMAOer and you start texting with a ha-ha, you're not going to become a ha-ha just because of exposure. You are going to stay an LMAOer. Don't worry. So the answer to the question is no, you can't have a comma. Because a comma text says my identity, and if I gave you a comma, I'd be mimicking you, not converging. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Well, I would respond to that in almost the opposite way as I did the last one. The last one was a burning political and social issue that I think quite a lot about. This is something I admit I'd never thought about, whether laughter particles converge and whether commas don't. And so this is something I didn't know, and I'm pleased now to know it.
I am just going to be sitting there looking at back through all of my own chat logs because I can't obviously look at my future ones because now that I know this, who knows what I'm going to do. But I can fortunately go back and look at my old chat logs and say, have I been doing this? Is this something that I converged on? So I'll report back, at the end of this. We'll see what happens. Okay. Next up is Kelly E. Wright and Kevin B. McGowan, who...
Hi, Kelly.
Hello, Kevin.
Hello, Kelly.
Hello, Kevin.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
What you've just heard and responded to are Kelly's 3 native dialects, and we're using these dialects in a revamped replication of a landmark dialect discrimination study.
20 years ago, John Bob moved to San Francisco and started looking for an apartment. And he noticed that his callback rate seemed to vary based on which of his native dialects a property manager heard.
And crucially, these callbacks seem to be correlated with the racial composition of the neighborhood, so that the smaller the black community within a neighborhood, the less likely Baugh was to get a callback with his African American voice.
So the 1968 Fair Housing Act protects home buyers from discrimination. So if I walk into a rental property office, a property manager cannot legally choose which properties to show me based on their perception of my blackness or affluence. But dialect discrimination happens faster than that. It keeps me from even getting to the door. And as far as we're aware, 0 cases of dialect discrimination have been brought under the Fair Housing Act.
To make a case like that, a lawyer needs to be able to establish a predictable link between the features of a voice and the perceived social identity of the talker. So the original study convinced linguists that we can hear race in a voice, but it's clear from this lack of any cases that the plaintiffs need more support.
Housing has always been separated along color and class lines. Every U.S. city has this history written on its streets. Today, the maintenance of such segregation is covert. And to understand how this works, we need to know more about who's answering the phone. So we surveyed rental professionals across the country, asking them questions like, what are some qualities you find appealing in a potential tenant?
Now, ideally, nobody is going to respond to that question by saying race plays an important role, right? So legally, they are not supposed to, but also they may not realize they're discriminating at all. They say things like,
appealing isn't really part of the process. All qualified applicants are accepted if units are available.
right? But they also say things like, I don't expect people to come dressed for a job interview, but that is essentially the first step.
But recognize that speaking standard English is putting a business suit on your language.
And they say, be well spoken and considerate on the phone. And without even realizing it, right? Our beliefs about language and our beliefs about race shape these kinds of statements. They cause these kinds of statements.
Folks, people think that sounding non-standard is about ignorance or laziness. It isn't. Accent is who you are, where you're from, and what you do. And when you open your mouth to speak, you reveal your identity, not just your ideas. And what we can contribute is a model of how that relates to covert discrimination.
Right, so to investigate this, we asked 34 people for their initial impressions of the person behind the recordings of Kelly's 3 native dialects. And the first thing we learned is that, yes, people seem to be able to hear the identities we expect them to be able to hear.
And with that in mind, let's look at how their initial impressions changed based on the dialect differences. First, I am absolutely 3 different women. They aren't hearing one girl making 3 voices. And when I'm speaking standard English, so we're looking at the yellow bar here, I sound wealthier than my other selves. I sound more educated than my other selves. I sound more trustworthy than my other selves. They did this in 9 seconds, y'all.
So people accurately hear dialects. And people make social judgments based entirely on voices, and whether they know it or not, property owners care what you sound like on the phone. And what our work tries to do is to help people frame the argument that unconscious dialect knowledge affects real people's ability to live where they want to live in neighborhoods that they can afford to live in.
Folks, I am an exception. Many non-standard speakers cannot move fluidly between their voices.
And they shouldn't have to, right? So when we linguists talk about languages as all equal and all equally communicative, and when we say that they're all rule-based systems, we're not just making an esoteric claim about how language works.
These systems are voices that belong to real people.
Yeah, so we use languages to make judgments about people. Judgments shape our behavior, and behaviors shape lives. Because where you're allowed to live is maybe the most visible marker of privilege. And what we're interested in are the invisible linguistic forces that dictate that privilege.
We've seen this "we want our neighborhood to be our neighborhood" mentality disproportionately affects minorities. 20 years ago, Purnell, Izzardi, and Baugh found solid evidence for dialect discrimination. What we will be able to do is give millions of victims the empirical linguistic evidence needed to prove it. And we will be able to break a 150-year cycle of color and class struggle.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelly and Kevin. That topic couldn't be more important. It's not just a matter of segregation, where we live and whom we know and whom we live next to, but it's also a matter of where you build wealth. The housing is most people's biggest stock of wealth. If you own a house, you have something to build on and build your life around. And so this topic couldn't be any more important. I thought it was an ingenious look at what this means.
Yeah, I think it's a great example of ways of prioritizing linguistic engagement like this event, but also thinking about how, okay, there's this classic study that the public should know about, the public should be able to utilize, but it's missing a piece of information that makes it citable by a court. Like, how can it be used more effectively, in particular in communities? How can it be used more effectively by the general public? So that was a really great example of kind of tying together, picking up on strains of research and bringing it into continued relevance. And now we'll have Greg Contras.
Imagine you're in a world with 3 different horses. Horse 1 jumps over a fence. Horse 2 also jumps over the fence, but horse 3 decides she's not going to jump over the fence. In the resulting world state, 2 out of 3 horses have jumped. Now imagine Mary here describes the scenario as follows. Every horse didn't jump over the fence. Did Mary speak correctly or not? This is a truth value judgment. And given the central role they play in determining the meaning of our sentences, today I'd like to offer you a cautionary tale about interpreting them. So, these 2 out of 3 scenarios are very interesting because adults and kids give very different patterns of responses. Adults readily endorse the utterance, but most kids do not. So what's going on? Well, the sentence is ambiguous, with 2 different interpretations depending on the logical scope of every and negation. Under what's known as the surface interpretation, we say that every horse didn't jump, meaning none of them did. Under what's known as the inverse interpretation, we say that not all the horses jumped. In this 2 out of 3 scenario, only the inverse interpretation is true. It is the case that not all the horses jumped. So should we conclude that only adults are able to grammatically access that inverse scope interpretation? Well, that's not the end of the story, because in fact we can make kids a lot more adult-like with greater rates of utterance endorsement. One way to increase endorsement uses what's known as an explicit contrast clause. So now I tell you early on that every horse jumped over the log, but every horse didn't jump over the fence. And kids' endorsement jumps to 60%. But why? This explicit contrast clause affects your world knowledge. We've learned that horses are pretty good jumpers, so we might expect them to jump over the fence. This explicit contrast clause also affects your conversational goals. Hearing that every horse jumped over the log, we might then want to know not whether any horse jumped over the fence, but whether all of them did. But which factor actually causes children to endorse the utterance more? Is it the pragmatic factors of world knowledge and conversational goals, or is the root cause the grammatical access to inverse scope? To tease apart the independent contributions of these factors to the complicated process of language understanding, we're going to need a pretty beefy tool, a computer with which to develop a computational cognitive model of the language understanding process. Such a model allows us to explicitly manipulate each factor to measure its effect. Now, our model is conceived within the Rational Speech Act modeling framework, which views language understanding as recursive social reasoning between speakers and listeners. The good news is that modeling this recursive social reasoning is just a whole bunch of math, but that's also the bad news. For our purposes, we're really just interested in the probability of endorsing an ambiguous every not utterance in a 2 out of 3 scenario. Here's a look at model predictions. On the y-axis, you have the probability of endorsing the every not utterance. Higher values mean more adult-like, lower values mean more childlike. Here's a look at the grammatical factor, how likely I am to access a surface none versus an inverse not all interpretation. Here's a look at the manipulation of world knowledge, moving from lazy horse expectations to the expectation that horses are very likely to jump. And here's a look at the manipulation of conversational goals, changing the goal from deciding whether any horse jumped to whether all of them did. What we see is a much larger effect on endorsement from our pragmatic factors than from the grammatical factor of scope axis. We see this even more clearly when we let the factors interact. So here the goal is set to whether all of the horses jumped, and I believe that horses are very good jumpers. On the x-axis, I'm manipulating the access to grammatical scope, which has next to no effect. The pragmatic factors completely overwhelm it. Now, this happens because endorsing this utterance requires no disambiguation at all. Either interpretation, none or not all, fully answers the question of whether all the horses succeeded and informs me that my prior expectation of total horse success doesn't hold. Our truth value judgments tell us next to nothing about the specific interpretations that adults or kids are accessing. But they do tell us about their ability to manage the pragmatic context, and that's where kids differ. So now you have the cautionary tale. Before you can start interpreting truth value judgments, you've got to understand the pragmatics that goes into giving them. And we can accomplish that with just a little bit of math. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think another really interesting study, one of those that I'd put in the category of things a lot of lay people haven't thought about, because this is one of those sort of contrived studies that once you look at it, it's quite cool, but it's something that average people don't think about very much. And it also introduces the lay listener to something that they haven't thought about a lot, which is pragmatics. The whole concept of pragmatics and how that works in the language system is something that is not sort of out there in the world as much as it could be. So I think that's a plus there.
Yeah, I thought it was effective to keep going with the same sentence and use, I mean, I'm sure in the experiment they did multiple sentences, but keep things going with the same sentence so that we can follow, what happened previously and how this new one differs and how this new context differs. And it's an easily visualizable sentence, which helps us, form what's going on in our mind so that we don't get too distracted by the math. And next up is Jordan Ackerman and Noah Harmelin.
Hello? Hello there, and welcome to the world of Pokemonikers, a study of sound symbolism in Pokemon names.
To begin, let's review the relationship between sound and meaning. There's a well-known linguistic principle called arbitrariness of the sign that says that the sounds of a word should have no systematic connection to that word's meaning. This would imply, for example, that the sound like T or T doesn't actually mean anything on its own.
However, research has found that people do intrinsically sometimes associate sound with meaning, and this is what we call sound symbolism. One well-known example of this is the Boba Kiki experiment. If given a pointy shape and a blobby shape, people prefer to call the pointy shape Kiki and the blobby shape Boba, almost as if Kiki sounds pointier and Boba sounds rounder. But what is it about these words that sounds pointy or round? This can be a very challenging question to answer, especially if we're only considering just a couple of data points.
Another big question is, are these sound symbolic correlations universal? Meaning, do all listeners associate the same sound with a particular attribute, regardless of the language they speak? Or, are these sound symbolic correlations language specific, with possible overlaps across languages?
So our goal is to determine the distribution of sound symbolism across English and Japanese. But a major difficulty is finding a suitable data set, because ideally, we'd want a set of fixed cultural reference with quantifiable attributes which may correlate with sound properties, but which have different names in different languages.
Luckily, Pokemon meets these requirements, as pointed out by Kawahara and colleagues. There are over 800 unique Pokemon species, often with different names in different languages, and importantly, with quantifiable physical attributes. Kawahara investigated 2 of these physical attributes in Japanese names, and we extend the scope to include English as well as a wider range of physical attributes.
So what are these physical attributes? Well, among other things, Pokemon have height and weight characteristics, as well as what are called power statistics, which dictate how strong or weak a Pokemon is in battle. In addition, certain Pokemon species may metamorphose into a stronger stage as they grow up. This stage of development is what we call a Pokemon's evolutionary stage.
So here's a snapshot of our data. On the left, you'll see one of our fixed cultural reference, Bangarasu, or Tyranitar in English, and his associated quantified attributes. And on the right, you'll see the sound properties that we considered in Pokemon names, chosen based on the previous literature.
So our task is to determine if there are correlations between a Pokemon's physical attributes and the properties of the sounds in that Pokemon's name. We went about doing this using these state-of-the-art statistical methods.
And here are the results. On the left, you'll see the sound properties we just mentioned. On the right, each column lists the physical properties that are associated with sound properties in English or Japanese. Green denotes a positive correlation, and red denotes a negative correlation.
So for example, you see that name length is positively correlated with weight. Pokemon with longer names tend to be heavier. And this is true in both languages, but other correlations seem to be language specific. So for example, labial consonants like p and m seem to correlate negatively with height, but only in Japanese. But what we don't see are any instances of a particular sound property having opposite interpretations in the 2 languages. If a correlation is positive in one language, we don't see that same correlation be negative in the other language.
So in a nutshell, we found 3 sound symbolic correlations that were shared across English and Japanese, but we also found 11 sound symbolic correlations that were specific to one language or the other. And we can see that the landscape of sound symbolism is complex. So we will have to continue to expand the scope of this study in order to get a better picture of the true distribution of sound symbolism.
So our study's off to a great start, but the world of Pokemon has so much more to offer. And as we expand our study, we'll be considering more Pokemon attributes, such as body shape and color, as well as looking at other languages, including Chinese, Korean, and Russian.
And as we include additional languages, we should get closer to determining the degree to which sound symbolism is language-specific, shared across multiple languages, or even universal. And we're also quite eager to find out if it continues to be the case that the sounds, we're also quite eager to find out if it continues to be the case that a particular sound does not represent opposite meaning in different languages, as we saw in English and Japanese.
And of course, the closer we get to understanding the nature of sound symbolism, the closer we get to truly understanding the meaning behind future made-up words.
Thank you.
Well, I think if you polled lay people, they might not say that this is the most obvious political or social important study that they could have done, but this is just in that category of just cool, just intellectually delightful. And I think that presenting that kind of thing to people who haven't encountered linguistics before is just the kind of thing that might make them fall in love with it. They might not have ever thought about the fact that kiki sounds kind of sharp and pointy, and it's one of those things that makes people fall in love, and I think that's a very positive attribute to this.
Yeah, I think this is a classic example of the kind of frivolous topic, interesting results and I liked how at the end it pointed out, okay, if we zoom out, here's what we're trying to do, here's what we're trying to accomplish. This does have advantages as a data set, despite what it might seem like as a initially frivolous topic. How are we doing for technical things here? Do you have slides? Oh, here they are. Never mind. Good. So, I'd like to introduce Lynn Howe and Ryan Lepik.
Is this on? Okay. Hi, everyone. Before I start, I do want to let you all know that I do not have a white man's voice. That is my co-author who's speaking and I'm signing. So, on that note, most of us speak a language that requires the use of our vocal tract and our ears. However, people who sign use their face, their body, and their hands to communicate instead. So what's cool about sign language research? Well, it can help us to figure out which properties of spoken language are actually properties of language more generally, not reliant on speech alone. So our project is focusing on a question that has to do with how words change, how they change over time, what they look like, and what they mean. So we're looking at American Sign Language, and we're looking at one family of signs that's called look at. And understand that ASL does not have a written language, so we use English glosses to label signs. So here we have a family of signs that are labeled as look at, but it doesn't mean that it means the same as look at in English. Instead, we're really basing it on the discourse, and we'll explain that soon. So how can we research this sort of question? Well, one way that linguists do this research is to use a corpus. So that's data that we can research to see how words change, what they look like, and what they mean. And spoken languages, we've also seen have large corpora that are very accessible, but most of those corpora are based on written text. However, when we're talking about a sign language without a written system, what do? Well, it turns out that there's an easy answer. Deaf people, they sign, they film themselves, they film their friends, and they film other people signing, and they film them on their phone or their laptop, and they upload all of that to the internet, which is really cool. And there's two advantages for researchers, which are that when they upload those videos, they're in the public domain and people can view them really easily. And those videos also represent the diversity of the signing population as well. So when we found these examples of look at on the internet, we analyzed a bunch of these videos from the internet, of course, and we coded them for several properties, which I'll list for you. First, we looked at those individual signs to see whether they have one or two hands involved. We identified whether they have path movement or none at all. If they do have path movement, is it straight or is it in a circle? Does the sign have any facial expressions with it, whether more grammatical or more emotional or affective? Is there any English mouthing that shows up with the words or none at all? And then finally, we looked at the overall meaning of the sign. So we weren't just looking at the forms, but we were also looking at how those words are used in context. So we found a couple of examples. So we found two broad functions for this sign that we're calling look at. The first has to do with vision. So really it's the physical action of looking at something. So if you're reading or if you're watching TV. But we also found that it's used for reaction, which has more to do with the signer making a comment about how they feel or their attitude about something. So you look at something and then you react. So it's less about seeing, but more about your reaction. Now I'm going to show you two examples, one of each of these two signs, or each of these two functions. So here this guy is warning people in the audience to watch for low flood waters rising. Uh-oh. Okay. Okay, well, so the guy, I'll show you what he says. Okay, so there's the path movement that has to do with the two hands. He mouths the word watch while he says it, and so we wrote that down. The second film shows a woman who's talking about her experience, her first time meeting former President Obama, and how he reacted when he found out that the woman is deaf. So he said, oh, and the sign that she used is one hand. It doesn't have path movement, but it does have this effective facial expression. Oh. Okay, so if you missed that one because it was a little bit fast, I'll show it to you here. So here we've got one hand, no path movement, and no mouthing, and the facial expression is more effective. So in general, when we were looking at all of these signs, we found that there were these two functions in look at signs, and they have different forms as well. So with the signs that more related with vision, there were two hands involved. They had more path movements, or either direct lines or straight lines or circles. There was less effective facial expression, and sometimes there was English mouthing that had to do with the meaning of the word. So for example, the English word watch, something like that, see, something like that. But most of the react signs had one hand, reduced path movement, less facial expression, but there was, or more facial expression and less mouthing. So our research opened with this question about the properties of human language, and we found that actually if we look at this pattern, we've also found in English something similar to this idea with look. So the idea of going to in English has to do with moving from a physical location, but gonna has to do with intention. So we see that these properties that show up in ASL also show up in speech as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and I think that's it for speakers, but we're still going to give a couple comments. So that was really interesting. I liked the kind of the parallels and pausing the sign in the particular, like on the second slide after the video, so we could really clearly see what was being talked about in that particular context, to kind of isolate that for people who are trying to follow that and aren't as familiar with American Sign Language.
And I think in general, the people out there don't know nearly enough about sign languages. They're not really fully aware that they are languages in the same way that English and Korean are, that the signs are arbitrary in the same way that the sounds are in most languages. They might have some connection to the real world referent, but they don't have to, and they don't often, and that makes them as fully grammatical and as rich as any language. I think there's unfortunately a belief out there that it still is something like very advanced mimicry, and there can't be enough said about the richness of sign languages, and that's still a big barrier to cross, and I think this is a good step in that direction. Should we say a few words about wrapping up or general impressions of our presenters today?
Yeah, I think we should say wrap up. Maybe we want to have both mics, actually.
Let's wrap.
Could do the Abbott and Costello routine. No. Yeah, I think so. Logistically, I think there's going to be some voting happening soon, but we are actually shockingly running ahead of schedule because the tech was so much smoother this year. So I think the first thing we need to do is give a big shout out to the organizers of this event. To Laura Wagner and Colin Phillips and Ann Curzan and, am I missing anybody? Dennis Preston, for organizing this event, making sure it happens, coaching all of these speakers last night, which I think was really helpful. I mean, I don't know what they sounded like beforehand, but they sounded great today. And I think that having that kind of support is really great. So if anyone's thinking of giving this a try, you will get coaching. You can get some support in doing this. We encourage people to keep applying for this in future years. Do you have something to say? Okay, so when we call for the vote, we're going to bring everybody back up on stage so you can remember what everybody looks like, and we will say their names. Well, once they all come up here, we'll read all their names off or something like that, just to remind you what they're called, because words are hard and I'm bad at names. So yeah, I think...
General impressions. What left out of you, having looked at all 8 presentations, did you notice any themes across them?
Oh, then why don't you sound like you have an answer ready to that question.
What will you be voting on today? What are your criteria for choosing your favorite 5-minute linguist?
I think I have a couple of criteria. One, I think, is, I think there's kind of an overall gestalt of like, what was someone's presentation? Was I engaged? Was I following it? Was I enjoying it? I think there's also something to be said for how difficult was the topic that they were trying to tackle? And how much does the public already know about the topic that they were trying to tackle? Because if the public is already if people in general are already kind of halfway there, some topics have to do a bit more legwork in order to establish that. So I think that's something else that I'll be taking into consideration. What about you, Lane?
Well, I think that I might take the opposite point of view just a little bit. I think that looking at the difficulty of the research and the ingeniousness of the research design and the hardness of the problem is something that's very important for you as linguists communicating amongst each other. But I think that I'll be voting very largely on the success of the presentation itself. The graphics, the explanations of terms, or in fact, I think very often
the lack of terms.
Yeah, the best thing to do, and if you're trying to reach somebody like me, is frankly you're trying to cram a linguistics class into 5 minutes, and you can't cram 50 minutes into 5 minutes. You can't talk fast enough to do that. So one of the things I would suggest to all people trying to reach out to these broader audiences is just skip the term. Just describe the real world thing, if at all possible. You have to define a term. Define it once and use it again, but if at all possible, leave any jargon that your mother, unless your mother's a linguist, leave any jargon that your mother doesn't know out of it, so that you're communicating as much of the meat of it, the content directly.
I think that's good advice. One of the other pieces of advice that I've gotten from actually a research study on how people understand new terminology is the idea of concept first, jargon second. So we have a tendency, because this is how textbooks are structured, to say, here's this new word, and this is what it means. If you can say, here's this question that we have, or here's this concept that is really important to know about, also, by the way, there's a word for it, people kind of follow that explanation more clearly. I think of it as, you know when you learn the word Schadenfreude, and you're like, wow, this thing that I'm very familiar with. Oh, that's awkward, the Germans have a word for it. I thought that was just me. If you were, an alien with no experience of human emotions, and you're like, there's this thing that the humans experience, it's called Schadenfreude, here's what it is. I don't think it would be as interesting to you to learn this word as when you get that shock of recognition because you already know the concept. So if we can think of this in terms of even teaching or in terms of explaining things, if you can motivate why people need the concept first, then they'll be begging you for a word for it. I've had people ask me for words for, jargon because I've given the whole explanation without using one, and they're like, there's gotta be a name for this thing when you put your hands on your throat and it buzzes. Like, you keep describing this, is there a word for it? I'm like, oh yeah, it's voicing. But if I start out saying voicing is this thing that you should know about, they're like, I still don't know why. So that's my top pro tip for explaining stuff to people. Concept first, jargon second. Motivate the why for the word before you give it to them. Make them ask you for the word for this. And if they don't ask you, then, I had a few people request that I actually give you a pun. So I'm going to take a straw poll of the room to see if the room would like a linguistics pun. Okay. And kudos again to the organizers for making it such that there were no technical difficulties that required a pun, but you get just one anyway. Why did the phonologist buy apples at the store last night? Because there were minimal pears. All right. Let's bring all the contestants up, unless we have any further orders of business to do. Put the voting slide up, please, whoever's doing the slides. And we'll bring the contestants up. Okay, so there's some instructions. As the contestants make it to the stage, we will also read these instructions. This is a web voting thing. Ooh. Because we didn't want to force you to put up your hands for whether or not you liked your friends and colleagues. That's really awkward. Please don't just vote for your friends and colleagues. We're counting on you. Okay. So, you go to this website, slido.com. You use event number 3072. You pick a person. There's an important note here. The people on the voting list are in a different order than they talked in. This is to make you use your brain.
Now, could those of you who are in pairs stand distinctly together and apart from those next to you so that...
We need some constituent structure here.
It's clear who the pairs are. And maybe we can go by and have everyone give their names again.
Great.
And a brief précis of what you said.
Do we want to put the people on in order that they talked in just to help the feint of memory? Yes. Okay. So Zachary Jagger, who is invisible. Does someone want to be a stand-in Zachary? Okay, you're stand-in Zachary. Lane is now Zachary. We have Georgia Zell. We have Lauren Ackerman. We have Michelle McSweeney. We have Kelly Wright and Kevin McGowan. We have Greg Contras. Yes, you're Greg. Okay. We have Jordan Ackerman and Noah Harmelin. And we have Linho and Ryan Lepik. Okay. So, how is everybody doing? Good. Slow loading. We're just gonna play some Jeopardy theme music.
Does everybody remember the Wi-Fi code?
Copyright.
Does anybody need the Wi-Fi code? It's Carolina, all lowercase, and you're on the GA something or another network in case you're not on the Wi-Fi already.
Oh, that's a good piece of advice. If there's anybody who doesn't have a device to vote on, can they vote twice from the same device? Can they borrow one from a neighbor? Is that a thing we can do?
We have presumed 100% smartphone and tablet penetration here, unfortunately. Or laptop plus
We have
smartphone
real-time
plus,
updating. Wow.
tablet.
Okay, do we want to make the people sit down now, or are you leaving them up? I don't know.
I think people can sit down because we're gonna deliberate for a few moments, are we not?
We also need to deliberate a bit. We should have another person for comic relief. I can give someone my other puns.
Carolina, all lowercase.
Carolina, all lowercase.
Yeah,
is the
Carolina's in North and
password
South Carolina.
for the network.
The question from the contestants is, can they vote too? Hands up, who thinks they should be able to vote? Who thinks they shouldn't be able to vote? Okay, the ayes have it. So you do get to vote.
So shall we maybe let the contestants sit down?
Okay, so take your seats.
Okay.
We're going to
The
deliberate for a few
contestants can
minutes, and
sit
we will have a winner for you after everyone in the audience has voted, after Gretchen and I have voted, and we have a tiebreaker as well. So the rules are that we have 3 votes, essentially. Gretchen's vote, my vote, and your vote. And if we all vote for someone different, then the tie-breaking vote will go to Professor Ann Curzan. So.
Oh, okay, good.
No, she's shaking her head.
She's shaking her head?
Okay, she's
she's
nodding
doing
her head. She's back in. Okay.
She's hoping it doesn't happen. But we can announce a runner-up if a runner-up ends up happening. If it's 2-1 or something, then there can be a runner-up. I would kind of like a little bit of time to think because I have not decided yet.
Okay, talk amongst yourselves for 5 minutes. We're going to deliberate, and we will get back to you with the
Okay.
result. Thank you very much. All right, well, we have a winner. And the winner is La La Land. Sorry.
Lane told me he wasn't going to make that joke, and he made that joke anyway.
I couldn't miss that. That makes me Warren Beatty, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm so vain. Okay. I'd like to give a big thank you to our sign language interpreters who have dealt with Gretchen and me, who speak about 100 miles an hour. And with 8 different presentations, difficult material, different speakers, very different styles, and they did a fantastic job. So thank you very much to you. And now, Gretchen is going to give us the big reveal. It's not going to be La La Land, I'm afraid.
We have unfortunate news. So what we have actually decided to do is Lane and I came up with our top things. We ranked them separately, and the audience had a very clear top 3 as well. So Lane and I each independently had a top 3. The audience had a top 3. Those top 3 were all the same 3 people. So what we have decided to do is award a winner and 2 runners-up because we think that we don't want to rank everybody all the way down because that would get really depressing all the way really quickly.
Nul point for those of you who know the Eurovision Song Contest.
Yeah. So, but we do want to recognize that there was a clear trend in the data from everybody, and to recognize the top 3 in this case. So I think we're going to start with the 2 runners-up to keep the momentum going.
Would you like to announce the first one, Gretchen?
Okay. I'm going to announce the first runner-up was Zachary Jaggers.
Should we say a brief word? I thought that was a great, neat, short explanation of such an interesting topic. It was things like phonology that a lot of ordinary folks might not think about, but they could connect very easily to the meat of the subject itself. They all have thought about whether you say Iraq or Iraq and how language connects to politics, and it was a very, very simple explanation. There was no linguistic terminology used in that one at all. They used the lot and the trap instead of describing the different high front and such like that. And I thought it was a very, very neat and elegant explanation of the work, and so I thought that was a great little piece.
And we really liked the use of Zachary's use of graphs and statistics because he revealed the graphs kind of piecemeal. They were very easy to follow. It was clear what was going on in all of the different graphs, which was actually my comment for him at the time. And it was one of the things that I kept thinking about, like, I should be making graphs more like that. So yeah, so we like Zachary. You all like Zachary. Lane, would you like to announce the other runner-up?
Yes, and so we haven't ranked the runners-up. These are sort of tied runners-up. The other runners-up are Kelly Wright and Kevin McGowan for covert segregation in the housing market.
Let's have them stand up.
a huge topic. Like I said before, it couldn't be any more important. Wealth building through home ownership is one of the most crucial topics in American political economy. A great experiment and well explained. There wasn't anything that would lose a non-linguist, and I thought it was truly an excellent piece of work.
I really also liked their rapport as co-speakers. I think that's, because it's very clear they had practiced, they were very smooth, the transitions between speakers were very smooth, and figuring out who was saying what and what was going on. They had an easy rapport, which made the talk really, really great to follow.
Gretchen, I think the tradition is that I hand you the envelope and that you present.
We've already done the La La Land jokes.
Okay,
we're not doing any more La La Land jokes. All right, so I have the great pleasure of announcing that the winner of the 5-minute linguist competition. Do we have any announcements we need to make before this ends? The winner of the 5-minute linguist competition is Michelle McSweeney.
If I could just say as a journalist, again, you're trying to reach people like me, and one of the things they teach you in journalism is to open with a story, with a person, with a real thing in the world. If you start off saying, phonology is, then you're going to lose a lot of people out there in the real world very quickly. But Michelle opened with her mother and herself, and I thought that was a great way to bring in the concept of linguistic convergence, assimilation, that coffee thing, and that the idea of convergence is something we're all familiar with, but so many people hadn't noticed it in their own lives, or they may even have noticed it and feel guilty about it. But we had this elegant explanation that it actually makes you warm, that it's a good thing to do, that you shouldn't be embarrassed of the fact that you sort of converge on your conversation partner. And I think it's a great topic for those people out there who are sort of embarrassed about their convergence. And then we took it in a whole new direction with a great data set from texts and a sort of surprise result.
Yeah, I really liked this as well. I'm also biased as an internet linguist, so I was trying to not vote for Michelle because I was worried that I was too biased because I'm going to have to request a copy of the paper. But also, so I let myself be talked into this. But I think what was interesting about this was that it was internet linguistics in the, texting and emoji sense, but it was also using that as a lens to look at language more broadly and say, what are the features of language that we converge on? What are the features of language that we don't converge on? And so I think it also raises this interesting theoretical question by looking at the data through a different lens. I think that we are wrapping up. I'd like to thank one more time all of the contestants for participating in this event. And for delivering such fantastic talks. I think I see video cameras, so I presume there's going to be video of this event that you can look for at some point in the future online if you want to share their research. There is going to be video with other people once those come up. You can keep track of the LSA's social media feeds and email blasts, and they will send you the video so you can share those things beyond the confines of this room, and we really hope that you do. One more thanks to the organizers, the sign language interpreters, and thanks so much to all of you for being here. Thank the sponsor. Oh yeah, we have a sponsor. Great, thanks. We also like to thank the University of Utah Department of Linguistics, who sponsored this event. If you would like your university to sponsor this event in future years, I'm sure that the organizers would be delighted to hear from you. You should email Laura Wagner.
It sounds boring if you've never had to organize one of these things, but they do not come together without sponsors. So the gratitude is very real. So thank you very much to the University of Utah's Linguistics Department.
Thank you very much.